All right, so you want to talk about Roman law?
That's right, a legal system that still has an impact today, even after all these years.
It's crazy to think something that old could still be relevant. I mean, we're not talking about some dusty old scrolls or something. You wanted a deep dive on this right now. So we dug deep into actual legal texts, statutes, and modern
And
analyses.
that's what's so cool about Roman law. It's not just history. It's something that evolved as their society did.
So no just togas and chariots.
No, they really thought about their legal system. Like, take the 12 tables. These weren't just some abstract laws. They were about real life, like family arguments, fights over property, and what to do about your neighbor's tree when it drops fruit onto your property.
So it's like a direct look into how they live their lives. We can learn about their culture from this too.
You got it. And this grounded way of thinking is a big reason their legal system worked so well, even as their empire got bigger. I mean, think about it. How do you come up with laws that work for everyone, from farmers to politicians? The Romans figured it out.
That's really interesting because they had to have something that was flexible enough to work for all these different types of people across the entire empire.
Exactly. And that's what made their system so successful and why we're still talking about it today. And when it comes to practical matters, we have to talk about property.
Property. Okay.
It's something everyone understands, right?
Yeah, for sure. But I bet their idea of property was a little different back then.
You're right. They didn't just think about owning something. It was more complicated than that. They had this whole system for different levels of ownership.
Different levels. Like you could own something in different ways.
Exactly. Think about it like there was dominium. That was like the highest level of ownership. You had complete control over something.
Okay, that makes sense.
But then you had in bonus, which meant you could use something and benefit from it, but you didn't have total ownership.
So, like, what kind of situation would that apply to?
Imagine you buy this amazing vineyard, right? But you
Oh.
only get some of the rights to the grapes.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Right. And you can imagine how that could cause problems, especially since Romans loved their wine.
Yeah, that's a recipe for conflict for sure.
And you're getting at something really important here. This difference between types of ownership had a big impact on Roman society. Like, citizens and non-citizens often had different levels of property rights, which could create inequalities and legal battles.
So it wasn't just about legal theory, it was about real life and how people were treated.
Exactly.
It makes you think about how their legal system really impacted their daily lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of keeping things in order, their approach to inheritance was another big deal. They were serious about wills, who got what, and even disinheritance.
Disinheritance. So, like, getting cut out of the will completely, what would get you in that kind of trouble back then?
Well, disrespecting your parents was a big no-no,
Makes sense.
but it went deeper than that. They believed in keeping the family line going strong,
So, inheritance wasn't just about the money.
right? It was about the family's legacy. So if someone was considered unworthy, like if they wasted their money or behaved badly, they could be cut off.
Wow, tough crowd.
It was about maintaining order and stability, especially for powerful families.
So, it sounds like inheritance was a pretty big deal for them.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now let's switch gears and talk about contracts.
Okay, contracts. I'm listening.
The Romans were all about making agreements official and binding.
So I'm guessing they had a lot of paperwork even back then. Paperwork, agreements, sounds a bit like our modern world, doesn't it? But how did they actually make sure those agreements were ironclad in ancient Rome?
Well, they were surprisingly thorough, even without our modern technology. Remember we talked about how important order was to the Romans? They applied that same meticulousness to their contracts. One example that stands out is the concept of a literal contract.
Literal contract, it sounds pretty straightforward, but knowing the Romans, I bet there's more to it than meets the eye.
You're right. It wasn't just about writing down the terms of an agreement. They took it a step further. The act of recording a debt in a ledger in very specific and detailed terms actually made the debt legally binding. It was like the written word had its own legal weight.
So no more I'll pay you back later excuses. It was all there in black and white, or perhaps ink and papyrus.
Exactly.
Hmm?
It formalized the agreement in a way that was hard to dispute. It's a testament to their commitment to keeping things above board and preventing those he said, she said situations.
Mm.
But as you can imagine, even with their best efforts, there were always loopholes.
Ah, those crafty Romans and their loopholes. I bet you've got some good examples for us. What are some of the creative ways they found to bend the rules, even with those strict contracts?
Well, even with those meticulous records, some clever folks figured out how to game this system. One tactic was to deliberately introduce errors into the contract ledger. A misplaced numeral or a misspelled name could be all it took to render the contract unenforceable.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how they found ways to exploit those tiny cracks in the system.
It sounds like something out of a Roman legal drama. Speaking of dramatic situations, let's dive into some actual cases, shall we? Our sources mention that Roman law dealt with some pretty interesting scenarios.
Oh, absolutely. Roman law wasn't just theoretical, it was about addressing real-life dilemmas. For example, imagine you're a Roman citizen and you lend a valuable object to a friend. Tragically, that friend dies before returning the item. What happens then?
Well, in today's world, there's probably a legal process for that, but I'm guessing in ancient Rome it wasn't so clear-cut.
You're right, it could have been messy, but the Romans actually had systems in place to handle this. They recognized that obligations shouldn't just vanish because of someone's death. So even if the deceased hadn't explicitly left instructions about the object, Roman law provided ways to track down the rightful owner and ensure the lender wasn't left empty-handed.
That's pretty impressive. It shows a real understanding of fairness and trying to find a just solution, even in tricky situations.
Okay, hit us with another case, something truly unique to Roman law. All right, how about this? Ever heard of Noxal liability? Imagine your pet monkey, and yes, pet monkeys were apparently a thing in ancient Rome, gets loose and damages a neighbor's property.
Oh no, not the carefully cultivated Roman garden. Those meticulously pruned topiaries would be no match for a mischievous monkey.
Precisely. Now here's where it gets interesting. Under Roman law, you as the owner weren't automatically liable for the damage caused by your animal. Instead, you had a choice. Pay compensation for the damages or surrender the furry culprit to the aggrieved party.
That's a tough one. Fork over a hefty sum of sestertii or say goodbye to your beloved monkey. Talk about a dilemma. I guess it really depended on how much you loved that monkey and maybe how much your neighbor loved their garden.
Exactly. It's a quirky example, but it highlights something important about Roman law. It wasn't always about strict liability. They considered factors like the owner's intent and the circumstances surrounding the incident. And it shows how their legal system wrestled with issues that are still relevant today. Responsibility, ownership, and even the consequences of our actions, or in this case, our pets' actions.
It makes you wonder how they would have dealt with the legal challenges of our modern world. Self-driving chariots, maybe? Or perhaps disputes over virtual olive groves in some early form of the metaverse.
Now, wouldn't that be a fascinating deep dive? But for now, I think we've given you a good taste of just how influential and surprisingly relatable Roman law really was.
Absolutely. It's more than just ancient history. It's a foundation for legal principles we still grapple with today. So next time you hear about property rights, inheritance laws, or even liability cases, remember those toga-clad Romans? They were already tackling these complex issues centuries ago, and their solutions might surprise you. And who knows, maybe a deep dive into Roman law could give you a fresh perspective on some of our modern legal dilemmas.